In a courtroom buzzing with anticipation, all eyes were on the commanding figure of Judge Alan Porter, known for his sharp tongue and an unsettling air of arrogance. Across the aisle stood Jamal Carter, a young black attorney with a quiet confidence that radiated through the tension-filled room. As the gavel echoed, Porter's condescending tone sliced through the air, a thinly veiled attempt to undermine Jamal at every turn. What unfolded next, however, would leave the courtroom stunned, dismantle deeply held prejudices, and set the stage for a moment of justice no one could have anticipated. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the latest high-profile civil rights case got underway. A grand, historic building with intricate wooden paneling, the courtroom exuded an air of authority and tradition. Journalists, activists, and curious onlookers filled the gallery, all eager to witness the clash between the legal system and the pursuit of justice. At the center of it all sat Judge Alan Porter, a seasoned judge with a reputation for his condescending demeanor and barely concealed prejudice. With his stern expression and clipped tone, Porter commanded the room, though his authority often leaned toward arrogance. He tapped his gavel sharply, silencing the murmur of the crowd. "Let's keep this proceeding orderly," he announced, his eyes scanning the room before landing briefly on the lead counsel for the plaintiff, Jamal Carter. Jamal rose from his seat with the grace and confidence of a seasoned attorney. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his calm demeanor and piercing gaze reflected years of experience. At just 38, Jamal had become one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the state. However, the tension in the room was palpable as Porter's gaze lingered on him a moment too long, a flicker of disdain crossing his face. "Mr. Carter, proceed," Porter said, his tone already laced with impatience. Jamal stepped forward, addressing the jury with a measured voice that carried the weight of his argument. He presented the facts with precision, detailing the injustices faced by his client, a young black man who had been wrongfully arrested. But as he spoke, Porter's interruptions began. "Get to the point, Mr. Carter," Porter snapped, cutting Jamal off mid-sentence. Jamal paused, meeting Porter's glare without flinching. "With respect, Your Honor, this point is critical to my client's case." The spectators exchanged glances, sensing the tension building. Porter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, and waved dismissively. "Make it quick." Despite the dismissive tone, Jamal pressed on, his voice unwavering. His argument grew more compelling with every sentence, drawing the jury's full attention. As Jamal reached a critical juncture in his presentation, Porter interrupted again. "Mr. Carter, this courtroom isn't the place for theatrics. Stick to the evidence." The remark hung in the air, heavy with implication. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Jamal didn't falter. He took a breath and continued with quiet determination. "Your Honor, I assure you, everything I'm presenting is directly relevant to the case," Jamal said firmly, his tone respectful yet resolute. The jury seemed captivated by Jamal's composure, even as Porter's demeanor grew increasingly antagonistic. By the time Jamal concluded his argument, it was clear that he had left an impression, not just on the jury, but on everyone in the room. As the court recessed for the day, whispers filled the gallery. Many discussed Judge Porter's behavior, while others marveled at Jamal's unshakable professionalism. But for Jamal, this was just another day in a system that demanded more from him than his white counterparts. He packed his papers calmly, preparing for the next round. Jamal grew up in a small apartment in a low-income neighborhood, the sounds of sirens and chatter filling the air. His mother, Diane Carter, worked 2 jobs as a nurse and a seamstress to provide for him and his younger sister. Diane was a woman of quiet strength, instilling in her children the importance of hard work and education. "You might have to work twice as hard, Jamal," she often said, "but you're just as capable as anyone else." Despite limited resources, Jamal excelled in school. He devoured books, finding inspiration in stories of leaders like Thurgood Marshall and Nelson Mandela. When he wasn't studying, he spent time at the community center, where mentors encouraged him to dream big. But life wasn't without its struggles. As a teenager, Jamal witnessed the injustices that plagued his community. Friends harassed by police, neighbors evicted without cause, and family members denied opportunities because of the color of their skin. Each incident deepened his resolve to fight for change. Jamal's path to law school wasn't easy. Scholarships and part-time jobs funded his education, but the systemic challenges persisted. At the prestigious Columbia Law School, he often found himself the only black student in his classes. Professors and peers sometimes questioned his presence, their doubts unspoken but palpable. Yet Jamal refused to be discouraged. He graduated at the top of his class, earning accolades for his sharp analytical skills and persuasive arguments. At his graduation ceremony, Diane sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as her son became the first in their family to hold a degree. From the moment he passed the bar, Jamal focused on civil rights law. He joined a non-profit legal firm, dedicating himself to cases involving police brutality, housing discrimination, and workplace inequity. In every case, he carried the stories of his community with him, determined to be a voice for those who had been silenced. His work earned him a reputation as a relentless advocate. One of his landmark cases involved securing a historic settlement for a group of factory workers exposed to dangerous chemicals. Another time, he fought for the exoneration of a wrongfully convicted teenager, earning national attention for his efforts. Throughout his career, Jamal found guidance in Judge Harold Green, a retired black judge who had broken barriers in his own time. Judge Green became a mentor, sharing wisdom born from years of navigating a system rife with prejudice. Jamal, Green once said, "You'll face people who doubt you, who belittle you. Don't let their ignorance define you. Your dignity is your strength. Stay steady, and the world will eventually see what you're made of." Those words echoed in Jamal's mind every time he entered a courtroom, especially when facing figures like Judge Alan Porter. Green's mentorship reinforced the values Diane had instilled in him: resilience, integrity, and the belief that justice was worth fighting for. As Jamal walked through the bustling streets that evening, he felt the weight of the trial bearing down on him. Porter's hostility in the courtroom wasn't new, but it was a reminder of the barriers that remained. Yet Jamal also knew the power of perseverance. He had seen it in his mother, in his community, and in the faces of the clients whose lives he had changed. At his modest office, he reviewed his notes late into the night, readying himself for the next day. He wasn't just fighting for his client, he was fighting for every person who had been dismissed, belittled, or silenced. The challenges were steep, but Jamal had faced them before. And as the city lights glimmered outside his window, he reminded himself of the mantra he had lived by for years: justice is never given, it must be earned. Courthouse buzzed with quiet murmurs as lawyers shuffled between courtrooms and clerks organized stacks of paperwork, but all the whispered conversations seemed to orbit around one figure: Judge Alan Porter. His treatment of Jamal Carter during yesterday's proceedings had not gone unnoticed. Those who had worked in his courtroom before shared knowing glances, recognizing the pattern. Judge Porter's prejudice was an open secret. In his private chambers, Porter leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee as he recounted yesterday's events to a visiting colleague. With a smirk, he dismissed Jamal's performance, claiming, "Carter thinks he's some kind of legal prodigy, but his arguments are flashy and shallow. Typical." His tone was casual, as though his words held no weight, yet they reflected years of ingrained bias. His colleague, visibly uncomfortable, offered only a faint chuckle, avoiding direct engagement. Porter's reputation as both authoritative and intimidating ensured few dared to challenge him openly, even when his behavior crossed professional lines. Outside his chambers, the whispers continued. Lawyers in the hallway exchanged cautious remarks about Porter's conduct. "He cut Carter off every chance he got," one attorney murmured. "It's like he wanted to embarrass him in front of the jury." Another nodded grimly. "That's Porter for you. If you're a minority, he'll find a way to undermine you, no matter how prepared you are." For Jamal, these dynamics weren't new. He had faced judges like Porter before, men who viewed his success as a threat and wielded their authority to remind him of his place. Yet he remained composed, his confidence rooted not just in his abilities, but in the knowledge that his arguments carried the weight of truth. Meanwhile, the trial had caught the attention of journalist Rachel Torres, who was seated quietly in the back of the courtroom, scribbling notes. Initially assigned to cover the high-profile civil rights case, Rachel's focus had shifted to the judge himself. The dismissive tone, the constant interruptions, and the subtle but unmistakable condescension. These weren't isolated incidents. Rachel had seen glimpses of it before, in other cases Porter had presided over. Intrigued, she began digging into his judicial record, sifting through past rulings and noting patterns that painted a troubling picture. Her findings were damning. Time and again, Judge Porter had issued harsher sentences for black defendants, dismissed civil rights cases on shaky technical grounds, and made demeaning remarks toward minority lawyers. Clerks and junior attorneys, when interviewed off the record, shared stories of veiled racism and unprofessional behavior in his courtroom. "He's been getting away with it for years," one clerk confided. "No one ever calls him out because he's untouchable." As Rachel pieced together her investigation, the tension in the courthouse grew palpable. Jamal, aware of the quiet storm building around him, stayed focused. His arguments in the courtroom were sharp and precise, cutting through Porter's attempts to derail him. Yet he could sense the shifting energy in the room. The jury and spectators were no longer just watching the trial. They were witnessing something bigger. The judge's prejudice, so long ignored or excused, was now being brought into the light. By the end of the day, whispers about Judge Porter's behavior had reached even those outside the courthouse. Social media posts from courtroom observers began circulating, with users sharing clips and anecdotes about Porter's dismissive treatment of Jamal. The journalist's preliminary findings had been sent to her editor, who quickly greenlit a full investigation. What had started as another day in court for Judge Porter was rapidly becoming a reckoning. The courtroom was electric with tension as the civil rights case that Jamal Carter was arguing reached its most critical phase. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A young black man had suffered life-altering injuries at the hands of the police, and Jamal was fighting for justice not just for his client, but for countless others who had faced similar abuses. The trial had garnered national attention, with activists and media outlets closely following every twist and turn. Judge Porter sat high on the bench, his expression a mixture of impatience and disdain as Jamal presented his arguments. Porter's dismissive behavior had become more overt as the trial progressed, cutting Jamal off mid-sentence, questioning his legal interpretations, and even making sarcastic remarks that left the audience murmuring in disapproval. "Mr. Carter," Porter interrupted for the third time that hour, "perhaps you'd like to consult the actual law before continuing." His tone dripped with condescension, but Jamal remained unshaken. Jamal stood tall at the podium, his presence commanding respect, even from those who sought to undermine him. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jamal said evenly, his voice steady, "the statute I'm referencing is directly relevant to this case. If I may continue?" His calm rebuttal left Porter momentarily speechless, his usual retorts falling flat in the face of Jamal's unwavering professionalism. The gallery, filled with supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers, watched the exchange closely. Among them was Rachel Torres, the investigative journalist, her pen racing across her notepad. The behavior she had observed from Judge Porter throughout the trial had only confirmed her earlier suspicions, and now she was determined to shine a light on the systemic biases that Jamal was battling against. As Jamal moved into his closing argument, the energy in the room shifted. Gone was the tension of Porter's interruptions. Now all eyes were on Jamal. He spoke with conviction, weaving together legal precedents, emotional appeals, and a deep understanding of the broader implications of the case. "This isn't just about my client," Jamal said, his voice ringing out across the room. "This is about ensuring that no one in this country is treated as less than because of the color of their skin. This is about justice." The gallery erupted in quiet applause, quickly silenced by Porter's gavel. "Order in the court," Porter barked, though his words carried less authority than they had earlier in the trial. He seemed to sense that the momentum was no longer in his favor. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd had gathered, many holding signs demanding justice for Jamal's client. Activists chanted, reporters conducted live interviews, and social media influencers live-streamed the scene. Jamal's handling of the case had already made him a symbol of hope for many, and the public was beginning to scrutinize Porter's actions as much as they followed the details of the trial. Within hours, clips of Porter's dismissive comments and Jamal's eloquent responses flooded social media. Hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #HoldJudges accountable trended nationwide, sparking conversations about judicial bias and systemic racism. Celebrities and public figures weighed in, amplifying the story to an even larger audience. Inside the courthouse, the jury began their deliberations. The weight of Jamal's arguments, combined with the public scrutiny of the case, left a clear impression on the jury members. The courtroom staff, many of whom had witnessed Porter's behavior for years, exchanged knowing glances. They could feel it. This trial was different. The truth was no longer confined to the courtroom. It had spilled out into the world, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable realities. Hours later, the jury returned with a verdict in favor of Jamal's client. The courtroom erupted in applause, and even Porter couldn't suppress a begrudging nod of acknowledgement as he read the decision. Jamal thanked the jury and his client, his calm exterior hiding the immense relief he felt inside. The case had been won, but the battle for justice was far from over. As Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, he was met with cheers and applause from the gathered crowd. Reporters thrust microphones toward him, eager for a statement. Jamal raised his hand for silence and spoke with the same clarity and passion he had shown in the courtroom. "Today's verdict is a step forward," he said. "But our work isn't done. We must continue to fight for a justice system that serves everyone equally." Unbeknownst to Jamal, a breaking news alert was already being drafted. His life and Judge Porter's were about to change forever. The courtroom had barely quieted down after the landmark verdict when a ripple of excitement swept through the legal community. News outlets and social media exploded with breaking headlines that left the nation in shock. Jamal Carter named the next Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Inside his chambers, Judge Alan Porter sat frozen, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. The announcement scrolled across the top of the legal news website he frequented. Historic appointment, Jamal Carter, first black Chief Justice in state history. The words seemed to taunt him, the weight of his earlier behavior crashing down like an avalanche. His face paled as he realized that the man he had so openly belittled in his courtroom was now not just his peer, but his superior. The news conference was broadcast live from the state capitol, where Jamal stood at a podium flanked by state officials. Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for a clear shot of the man whose career had become a symbol of perseverance and justice. Jamal, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, exuded quiet dignity as he addressed the crowd. "I am honored and humbled to accept this appointment," he began, his deep voice resonating with strength. "This is not just a personal milestone. It is a testament to the progress we've made as a society and a reminder of the work we still have ahead of us. The justice system should serve all people equally, regardless of their background, and I am committed to ensuring that vision becomes a reality." The audience erupted into applause, but Jamal's measured tone silenced the room once more. He spoke about his journey, the systemic challenges he had faced, and the importance of maintaining integrity in the face of prejudice. While he refrained from naming Judge Porter directly, his words carried an undeniable weight. Every voice matters, every case matters, and every individual deserves respect in a court of law. Back in the courthouse, Porter was haunted by the memory of his treatment of Jamal during the trial. The snide comments, the dismissive interruptions, every instance replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. He had spent years sitting comfortably in his position, confident in his authority and untouchable status. But now the tables had turned. As Porter stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his chambers, he heard murmurs in the hallways. Clerks, attorneys, and staff members whispered about Jamal's appointment, their words carrying admiration for the new Chief Justice. Porter's name was barely mentioned, except as a cautionary tale. The judge who had underestimated Jamal Carter had unknowingly set the stage for one of the most significant turning points in state history. Meanwhile, Jamal's press conference continued to dominate every screen in the courthouse. Reporters asked about his plans as Chief Justice, and he spoke of reforms aimed at increasing transparency, reducing bias, and improving access to legal representation for marginalized communities. He announced initiatives to mentor young lawyers and programs to educate judges on the importance of impartiality. "We are entrusted with great responsibility," Jamal said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Our decisions affect lives, families, and futures. We must never forget the humanity behind the cases we hear." For Porter, the realization that Jamal's words were not just aspirational, but a quiet critique of judges like him was inescapable. The power he had once wielded now felt hollow in comparison to Jamal's profound influence. As the press conference concluded, Jamal stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with supporters and dignitaries. The camera captured a brief but powerful moment. A young black law student handing Jamal a letter of thanks, tears streaming down his face. "You've shown me what's possible," the student said, his voice trembling. Jamal smiled and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Now it's your turn." In that moment, it became clear that Jamal's rise was not just a personal triumph, but a beacon of hope for others. Porter, still sitting alone in his chambers, realized that the era of unchecked prejudice and arrogance he had benefited from was coming to an end, and it was long overdue. The aftermath of Jamal Carter's appointment as Chief Justice sent shockwaves through the legal community. Judge Alan Porter, who had always carried himself with an air of invincibility, now found himself at the center of intense scrutiny. The same courtroom where he had ruled with unchecked arrogance now became a stage for his reckoning. The day after the announcement, headlines erupted with articles exposing Porter's behavior during Jamal's trial. Clips from courtroom recordings went viral on social media, showing Porter's blatant interruptions and dismissive tone. The judge who tried to undermine a chief justice became a trending topic. Comment sections overflowed with outrage, with viewers calling for immediate action. "People like Porter are why we need reform in the justice system," one commenter wrote. "This isn't just about one case. It's about a culture that tolerates bias." The social media uproar Porter's courtroom demeanor became a focal point for national conversations about judicial bias. Advocacy groups began to share stories of other lawyers and defendants who had faced discrimination in his courtroom. Hashtags like Judicial Reform Now and Accountability for Porter gained traction as activists demanded his removal. A particularly damning article published by an investigative journalist detailed Porter's long history of questionable rulings. Interviews with former clerks and attorneys painted a picture of a man who routinely belittled minority lawyers and leaned heavily against defendants from marginalized communities. The pressure mounted as civil rights organizations held rallies outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for all, not just the privileged, and end judicial bias." The courthouse steps, once a place of Porter's unchallenged authority, became a battleground for accountability. Under mounting public pressure, the state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced an immediate review of Porter's conduct. The committee, composed of senior judges and legal experts, began to comb through his case history, uncovering a troubling pattern. His rulings disproportionately favored corporations and institutions over individuals, and his remarks in court frequently crossed the line of professionalism. Porter's colleagues, many of whom had privately criticized his behavior but remained silent out of fear or indifference, now distanced themselves publicly. Statements condemning bias in the judiciary were issued by local bar associations, and whispers of Porter's potential resignation grew louder. For the first time in his career, Porter felt the weight of accountability. Facing intense backlash, he issued a public statement. "I deeply regret if any of my actions in the courtroom were perceived as disrespectful or biased. As a judge, my intent has always been to uphold the law with fairness and integrity. I welcome the Oversight Committee's review and will fully cooperate with their findings." The statement, however, was met with skepticism. Many saw it as a half-hearted attempt to save face rather than a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Critics pointed out that Porter's apology lacked specifics and failed to address the systemic issues highlighted by his conduct. Days later, the Oversight Committee released its preliminary findings, confirming multiple instances of unprofessional behavior and biased rulings. The report stopped short of recommending removal, but emphasized the need for serious disciplinary measures. Faced with mounting criticism and the possibility of impeachment, Porter announced he would take an indefinite leave of absence. In his resignation letter to the judiciary, he wrote, "I believe it is in the best interest of the court for me to step aside while these issues are addressed." While some saw this as an admission of guilt, others viewed it as a strategic retreat to avoid further public humiliation. Meanwhile, Jamal's appointment continued to galvanize support for judicial reform. Civil rights organizations called for mandatory anti-bias training for judges and increased transparency in court proceedings. Jamal, now leading the state judiciary, began working with advocacy groups to implement these changes. In an interview, Jamal was asked about Porter's situation. He responded with his signature grace, Accountability is essential in any profession, especially one as impactful as the judiciary. My focus is not on individual failings, but on creating a system where fairness and justice are the standard, not the exception. The community rallied behind Jamal's vision. Donations poured into programs supporting underrepresented law students, and grassroots movements advocating for judicial reform gained momentum. For Porter, the fallout was both personal and professional. His reputation, once a source of pride, was now in tatters. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, and invitations to legal events ceased. Public opinion had turned decisively against him, and even his past supporters began to question the integrity of his decisions. In the quiet of his home, Porter began to reflect on the choices that had led him here. The arrogance that once defined him now felt like a hollow shield, unable to protect him from the consequences of his actions. The very system he had manipulated to maintain his authority was now holding him accountable. The aftermath of Jamal Carter's appointment as Chief Justice sent shockwaves through the legal community. Judge Alan Porter, once a figure of unchecked authority in his courtroom, now found himself facing a wave of public scrutiny. The trial where Porter had belittled Jamal became the center of national attention, with courtroom recordings and accounts of Porter's behavior spreading rapidly across social media. Clips showed Porter interrupting Jamal repeatedly, his dismissive remarks loud enough to make the jury and audience uncomfortable. Outrage grew as hashtags like #judicial reform now and #accountability for Porter trended. Advocacy groups highlighted Porter's actions as a glaring example of the systemic biases embedded in the judicial system. Civil rights organizations rallied outside the courthouse, demanding immediate consequences, and even journalists covering the trial began digging deeper into Porter's history. The Judicial Oversight Committee, responding to the mounting pressure, announced a full review of Porter's conduct. They unearthed patterns of biased rulings that disproportionately impacted minorities and favored powerful institutions. Whispers of dissatisfaction from court staff turned into detailed accounts of unprofessional behavior. Colleagues who once remained silent began to publicly distance themselves, issuing statements condemning bias in the judiciary. The fallout didn't stop at professional scrutiny. Porter became a symbol of the accountability movement, with activists calling for reforms that would make it harder for judges like him to abuse their authority unchecked. Porter, facing the possibility of impeachment, issued a carefully worded statement claiming he regretted any actions perceived as unfair. The public, however, saw through the empty apology, further intensifying the backlash. Days later, Porter announced his indefinite leave of absence. The resignation letter, though framed as a personal decision, reflected a career forced into retreat. As the legal world continued to rally behind Jamal and his call for change, Porter faced the bitter truth of being held accountable for his years of arrogance and bias. Alan Porter's leave of absence marked the beginning of an unexpected transformation. Stripped of his once untouchable status, he faced the harsh reality of his biases and the damage they had caused. At first, he withdrew from public life, consumed by anger and denial. But as the weeks turned into months, Porter began reflecting on the backlash and the growing calls for accountability. He realized that the criticism wasn't a personal vendetta. It was a demand for justice that extended beyond him. During his time away from the bench, Porter attended a diversity seminar organized by a civil rights organization. Initially reluctant, he sat in the back row, arms crossed, feeling like an outsider. But as he listened to the stories of individuals who had faced systemic discrimination, something shifted. A young woman shared her struggles of being denied legal representation due to her socioeconomic status. An elderly black man recounted the trauma of being wrongfully convicted. Their words struck Porter deeply, peeling away the layers of his arrogance. For the first time, he saw himself through their eyes, a judge who had contributed to their pain rather than alleviating it. Determined to confront his past, Porter took additional steps to educate himself. He read books on systemic inequality, watched documentaries about civil rights leaders, and quietly volunteered at community legal aid clinics. These experiences offered him a perspective he had long ignored. One day, Porter found himself writing a letter to Jamal Carter. In it, he admitted his mistakes, apologized for his actions, and thanked Jamal for the grace and dignity he displayed during their courtroom encounters. Months later, at a national legal seminar, Porter and Jamal crossed paths. The retired judge approached his former adversary cautiously, extending his hand. Jamal shook it firmly, his expression neutral but his words encouraging. "Growth is a journey, Judge Porter. It's good to see you taking the first steps." The two exchanged a brief but meaningful conversation. Jamal urged Porter to use his experience as a cautionary tale, to educate others about the dangers of unchecked bias and the importance of humility. Porter took Jamal's words to heart. In the years that followed, he became a vocal advocate for judicial reform, speaking at seminars and colleges about his journey from arrogance to accountability. His talks often began with an acknowledgement of his own failings and ended with a call for empathy and fairness in the justice system. Though his reputation would never fully recover, Porter found solace in knowing that his story could inspire change. Under Jamal Carter's leadership as Chief Justice, the judiciary underwent a transformation unlike anything seen before. Jamal's reforms, driven by his own experiences of prejudice and perseverance, set a new standard for fairness, accountability, and inclusion. Courtrooms became more transparent, anti-bias training for judges became mandatory, and underserved communities were provided greater access to justice through pro bono initiatives. His vision was clear: a justice system that served everyone equally, regardless of race, class, or status. Jamal's mentorship programs flourished, encouraging young lawyers from marginalized backgrounds to pursue careers in law. One such mentee, a young woman named Elena, shared her story at a conference. "Because of Chief Justice Carter, I believed that I could belong in spaces that weren't designed for me. His mentorship didn't just change my career, it changed my life." Jamal's efforts inspired a wave of diversity within the legal profession, ensuring that future courtrooms reflected the communities they served. Meanwhile, Alan Porter, now retired, became an unexpected ally in Jamal's mission. Embracing his past mistakes, Porter used his voice to educate others, sharing his journey as a cautionary tale. At a public forum, Porter admitted, "I was blind to the very principles of justice I was supposed to uphold. But through reflection and accountability, I've learned that change is always possible." His words resonated, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of self-awareness and growth. Jamal and Porter's collaboration became symbolic of what the justice system could achieve when humility met determination. At a national conference on judicial reform, Jamal delivered a keynote speech that left a lasting impression. Justice isn't just about verdicts or rulings, it's about humanity. It's about seeing the person beyond the case, the story behind the statistics. True justice begins with compassion. The courthouse that once bore witness to Porter's prejudice now stood as a beacon of hope. Under new leadership and Jamal's influence, it became a hub for community outreach and legal education. Annual workshops for aspiring lawyers and advocacy groups were held in the Grand Courtroom, the same one where Jamal had once been belittled, but had triumphed with grace. In the final scene, Jamal stands before a group of young law students at a mentorship event, reflecting on his journey. "I was once told I didn't belong here," he said, his voice steady yet emotional. "But I realized that change doesn't come from waiting for others to make space for you. It comes from breaking down the barriers yourself." The students erupted in applause, their faces shining with hope and inspiration. As Jamal left the stage, he paused briefly, gazing at the future generation of legal minds, knowing that his legacy was not just in the laws he helped shape, but in the lives he touched. The story concludes with Jamal walking down the courthouse steps, the sun setting behind him, a symbol of justice prevailing through resilience, reform, and the unwavering belief in equality.